It's essentially a visual translation of one of the core ideas of the Bible, and that is all human life is sacred. When you first approach the sculpture, you probably will mistake it for a real homeless person. And it's only after you get very close up and see the wounds on those feet, and that is the clue that you are actually looking at a sculpture of Jesus. I actually worked the form in clay. Then a mold is made of the piece, it's cast, and then it goes through the bronze processing. And almost every week, a new city is coming up and putting one permanently right there in the center of the city. To have the original model blessed by Pope Francis at the Vatican was so meaningful to me. Afterwards, I was introduced as the artist, and he told me it was a beautiful, excellent representation of Jesus. Intentionally, this sculpture, the face, is obscured. I realized that if I would put more of a face on the figure, I would lose part of the theology about it, that it's everyone.
The Canadian sculptor Timothy Schmalz has been placing copies of the sculpture you've been looking at in cities all over the world. He gave this work the name Matthew 25 because he's a follower of Jesus who was struck by these words, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." It's been interesting to observe how churches have responded to suddenly finding this sculpture near their buildings. Some people have been offended. One woman wrote a letter to the editor of the local paper complaining that this was an insult to the Son of God. A few churches have politely said, "No, thank you." But there are pastors who have embraced the image. One said, "This is a relatively affluent church, and we need to be reminded that our faith expresses itself in active concern for the marginalized of society. Jesus was, in essence, a homeless person." But that artist did not move on to other themes. Matthew 25 has inspired a whole series of Schmalz sculptures. Jesus as a hungry beggar, Jesus as a sick one to be cared for, Jesus as a stranger to be welcomed, and this one, illustrating the words, "I was in prison and you visited me."
Hi, my name is Tim Schmalz. I am a Christian sculptor, and this is one of my latest sculptures. It is a depiction of Christ in a prison, in a jail, behind bars. The interesting thing about this is I thought of the Gospels when Christ mentioned, "When you visited someone in prison, you visited me." So I took that, just like several of my other pieces, and did almost a visual translation of that idea. And so here again, I did not want to put the face of Christ, I did not want to put a full body, I just wanted to put the hands. So a viewer would come along and at first just notice the outstretched hand, and then after further investigation realize by the wound here that it is Christ. And also by just having the hands, it really becomes an intense, very focused piece. And the hands are the things that do all the expressing. With this hand out here, it's almost a gesture as if the figure wants you to visit. The one hand is open, and then the other is just like your typical holding on to the bars look that shows and enforces the idea that this figure is indeed behind bars. And my intention of this is when we look at the people that are in prison, that we show and we feel Christ's compassion when we think about the people in prison. And so this is hopefully a sculpture that will bring a lot of healing and a lot of love to a place in our society that doesn't get very much of it.
Timothy Schmalz understands something basic about the gospel, and he wants to make sure we understand it too. The essence of being Christ-like is compassion. Over the last few weeks, we've looked at the last stories Jesus told stories about watching and waiting for his return. In the first parable, one servant abuses the others. Jesus is saying, as you watch and wait, be good to each other. In the second parable, the master is late for the wedding, and some of the bridesmaids have no more oil for their lamps. Jesus is saying, keep your fire burning. Last week, in the third parable, the parable of the talents, we found out Jesus expects us to be fruitful and productive. But this week, we come to the final story about watching and waiting. The final story of all. The most personal, the most urgent, and in many ways, the most upsetting of all the parables. Let's begin reading in Matthew 25:31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand, and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Then he will say to those at his left hand, you that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they also will answer, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you? Then he will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Let's look one more time at the progression of these final four parables we've explored over the past few weeks. They make up the last major teaching of Jesus before he's arrested, according to Matthew. So we know that Jesus is saying, I'm about to leave. One day I'll come back, but here's what you should be doing in the meantime. First parable, treat each other well. Second parable, be prepared for when I do come home. Third parable, make the absolute most of your time, invest it wisely. And fourth parable, care for the most needy as you would me. And if you don't, you have no part in my kingdom. So you can see the progression from the simplest requirement to the most demanding. Each one is a little more demanding than the one before it. Behave, be ready, be fruitful, and be compassionate. The first is harm nobody, and the final one is help everybody. But it's the final one that is so devastating, because just hearing it measures our character. Jesus calls the role of the most socially unacceptable people, the sick, the hungry, the poor, the imprisoned. And we react the way we've been trained to through life, with a little wave of revulsion, with a twinge of distaste. Maybe we think of that person who begged us to roll down the car window, or that beggar on the sidewalk, someone we really had no time for, and then Jesus hits us with this revelation. That was me. The one you helped and encouraged, or the one you rejected and pretended you didn't see. It was me, the one you professed to follow. For Jesus, it's that and nothing else that groups us with the sheep or the goats. But wait, I attend church regularly. Sure, but were you compassionate in these moments? Well, I paid my taxes. I'm a good guy. Ask anybody. What if I asked those who needed help? That's who I'm asking. This is a tough teaching because, well, it's binary. You've got your sheep, you got your goats, and well, there's no door number 3. And isn't there some other way to get in with the sheep? We'd rather win a game of Bible trivia or get somebody to put in a good word for us, pull a few strings. All this about poor people? Is this really the way Judgment Day works? Let's think about this thing. First, about the sheep and the goats. Shepherd did let them mingle during the day before dividing them at night. Sheep, with their coats, were able to handle the cool air, but goats needed to huddle together. So Jesus, who loves shepherd analogies, reaches for another one here. It's simply the idea of sorting out the flocks before darkness falls. The idea is that our day on earth comes to a time of sorting too. But is this story really about heaven and hell? Not necessarily. Remember our first rule of parables. Look for the simple meaning and don't build an elaborate belief system out of it. Jesus does use the image of judgment here to drive his message home, and there is judgment. But can we conclude that a ticket to heaven is offered based on good works? Go on enough mission trips, operate enough soup kitchens, and your card will be stamped? That would do away with a lot of biblical teaching on grace, wouldn't it? We know that our works can't justify us before God. Only Jesus himself can do that. We don't perform good works because we're afraid of punishment. We do them because compassion comes natural to the children of God. Jesus also said, using a tree analogy, that we're known by our fruit. Fruit doesn't grow out of obligation. It grows because that's just what a tree does. We don't help the needy because we have to, or at least that's not how it should work. We help because our hearts overflow with the love of Christ, because we begin to see others not the way we used to, but the way God sees them. Opportunities to do something good seem to jump out at the children of God. They see someone hurting and they have to do something about it. And if that impulse isn't there, if we don't feel deep compassion, then that's a sign something's off in our connection with the Father. Compassion is one of the most beautiful words in the human language. It's defined as a feeling of deep sympathy and sorrow for another who is stricken by misfortune, accompanied by a strong desire to alleviate the suffering. The Latin root means to suffer, and com means together with. So, we're sharing someone's suffering. We feel sympathy for someone, but we feel empathy with someone. Mother Teresa said, "In the poor we meet Jesus in his most distressing disguises." But the distress should give way to compassion. These days we say, "I have a passion for good French cooking," or "I'm passionate about my workouts." But the original meaning is more about suffering. That's something everyone does. Suffering with. Helping to carry someone else's hurt. That's something only extraordinary people do. It's the very essence of Christ. Carrying someone's burden out of deep love. In Matthew 9:36, we read that when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. That verse has always jumped out at me. Do you ever look at people and see them as harassed and helpless, like shepherdless sheep? Sometimes anger can change to compassion in a fleeting second when God shows you someone in that light. When the prodigal son came limping home, his father saw him far off, and Luke says he was filled with compassion, and he went running to meet him, threw his arms around him, kissed him. Does this sound like people meeting obligations? Compassionate people have hearts you can almost hear pounding. Their feelings run deep. They see people who are harassed and helpless, and they can't look away. There's just too much Jesus in them not to let it flow. So when Jesus tells this parable, he's not trying to give you a heads up that you'd better pile up some more service projects, build up your benevolence portfolio while you can. Notice that in the parable, both groups are surprised by how they're sorted. The righteous had no idea they were doing anything righteous. "Lord, when did we feed you when you were hungry? We have no memory of visiting you in jail either." And Jesus says, "You were just being you." That is, you were busy at work as my hands and feet, even though you never thought about it that way. Christian's gonna Christian, you know? The unrighteous are surprised too. What do you mean we didn't feed you when you were hungry, Jesus? That's not fair. We didn't know it was you. And Jesus says, my children don't need to be tipped off first. This parable isn't a heavenly entrance examination. It's a guide to how the followers of Jesus can't help but act. Because when the Spirit of God comes to live within them, the compassion of God just begins to flow. If you think about it, we all know the goal is that people see Christ in us. But now we know the goal is also for us to see Christ in others. It comes full circle. If we as the human race did this thing right, everyone would treat everyone else like a king. Would you like to live in that kind of world? Yeah, me too. We're not likely to see it on this side of eternity, but we can get a pretty good preview when we live this life with compassion. Thanks for listening.
When I needed were you there? Were you there? When I needed were you there? And the creed of the name was what were you there? 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 I was hungry and thirsty, were you there? I was hungry and thirsty, were you there? And the creed of the name was what were you there? Were you When I needed a shelter, were you there? Were you there? When I needed a shelter, were you there? And the creed of the name was what were you there? Were you there? When I needed were you there? Were you there? When I needed were you there? And the creed of the name was what were you there? When